Hello and welcome to today's English Australia webinar about alternative feedback methods. This is Sophie from English Australia. Before we get started, I'd just like to check that everybody can see the PowerPoint slide on their screen and can also hear me speaking. So if you can you please type yes? Okay, wonderful. I have lots of yeses coming through. So I'll introduce today's presenter, Margot Palmer. Margot currently works at the University of Melbourne Bridging Program at Hawthorn Melbourne, where she's the Director of Studies. She's also currently studying her Delta, and I know probably a lot of you here today have done a Delta or are doing one, so you know that that's a really big achievement in and of itself. Margot's worked all over the world, and most recently she worked in Oman at the Military Technical College, which was run by Navitas, where she was an e-learning team leader. So thank you so much for presenting today's webinar, Margot.
No problem. So I hope everyone can hear me. Just type if you need me to repeat something or you want clarification, and we should hopefully have time for questions at the end. So this session was presented at our Big Day In last year, mainly aimed at students on the academic English programs and ways that we can give more effective feedback to the students. So the main aim of this was to explore different ways in which we could capture feedback and it would make it a lot more meaningful. And then a sub-aim was to make it a little less stressful for the teachers and a bit more tangible. So that's where this kind of came from. So if we think about feedback and we think about what mode of feedback do we normally use for writing and speaking skills, I think the main ones that teachers came up with when we were talking about this in the PD session was, for speaking it was quite often just written comments, or it was a one-on-one consultation. And it was done live, so as the students would stand up and do some speaking in front of the class, and the teacher would be writing comments and organising. And I felt that this was just quite, not onerous, but it meant that the teacher could be concentrating on a couple of different things while also trying to give feedback on the speaking activity that was taking place. And the other mode of feedback for writing was obviously the correction code, where the teachers identify the issue and try and get the students to come up with the correction. Obviously written comments, and then that would lead into one-on-one consultations. But all of these can be quite time-consuming. Sometimes the students aren't quite aware of what they need to do, and sometimes written comments they can come across as too direct or too kind or too nice. So we're trying to look at some different ways so that we could add some variety to the feedback, but make sure that it was effective. So it started on the Navitas Learning and Teaching website. There's a great webinar that's been recorded called Engaging Students with Feedback, how to do video comments, how do video comments measure up to written comments. And when I was watching this webinar, these two comments struck me. It was some research that they did. They found out that most teachers say they're a hard marker, and actually that's not what we're aiming for. We don't want hard markers, we want markers that are accurate and can mark to the descriptors and give effective feedback. And the other comment that came through from that webinar was that students don't read it. So often teachers spend hours correction coding and reformulating things, but actually the students kind of just look at it and go, well, you've done it all for me, so I don't need to. So building on those, we tried to come up with some methods that would be more effective. Is everyone with me so far?
Yes.
Good, thanks, Sophie. So these are the three different methods that we investigated: whole class feedback, verbal recorded feedback, and recycling feedback. And as we go through these three different methods, we actually try to always have a low tech, a mid tech, and a high tech, because it'll be that one day where you've done all your videos, but the internet won't work, or, there's always something that goes wrong. So we've tried to factor it in so people of different levels of technological skill can access these. So let's start with whole class feedback. So the main thing that we wanted to give feedback on was something like a standardized event. So something like a practice exam. So the students in this course, they do 2 readings and they have to write a critical response. And so once we had marked, the teachers had finished marking, we actually found the student with the highest mark and asked that student, would you mind if we made a video about your paper? This was one approach. It kind of rewarded the student who got the highest, and they kind of felt a little bit of honour of being asked. It also gave the students, not a model, not a teacher-written model, but a student-generated student-generated essay that was achievable for them. They could see why that paper scored higher than their paper without kind of losing face in front of the class. So we're just going to have a look. It's one of the video links that was sent. Just have a look at the first couple minute or two of that screencast. So basically we marked the paper, or the paper was marked by the teachers, and then we scanned it and then we made a video about the paper. So let's have a look at that now.
So here is some class feedback for the authorship analysis for the UMELB practice exam. Please take a moment to read this paper's introduction. There are 4 key elements here. They have introduced the author's names and spelt them correctly, you can see in pink. They have put the years in brackets. The year has just come off the page there, but it is there. And they have also correctly used the titles of the paper, making sure that the punctuation is correct, capital A for authorship and analysis, and who wrote the note. Be careful with the punctuation of that second article. You need to have capitals for who wrote note, and make sure that you have the question mark there. It's all part of the title, and it's very important that you copy that across correctly. The 4th element that they're looking for is an introduction to your paper, which is, in this case, they have said both papers address the 3 approaches, and then said, if the papers are structured differently. That can be done in many different ways, but this is a fairly good example of an introduction.
If you're interested in watching the whole paper, that's one of the links that was sent out prior to this webinar. So, I mean, a lot of it, these videos were just made to be shown in the class before the students got their papers back. So they would watch this video and we would treat it like a lecture. So they would be taking notes. What do you need in an introduction? What were the main points for the different methods? So they were basically almost doing note-taking activity from this. And this video was not available for them to download. They could only watch it in the class. Then they would get their scripts back and they would look for those elements. So we kind of turned it from a note-taking task into a feedback task. So we found this pretty positive. The students, in fact, liked it so much. Every time we had an exam, they were saying, right, and when do we get to watch the video about the best mark? So it kind of fed on itself, and the students were expecting to get it each time. There was a little bit of, we used a program called Jing to do the screencasting, and screencasting basically just videos what's on your computer and has your voice over the top, like you just saw in that video. Initially, it was a little hard to get your thoughts together to make the recording, and it's basically a one-stream recording. I think it's only up to 5 minutes, 5 or 3 minutes. So initially, it was just a little hard to get used to doing feedback that way. But once I got the technology mastered and I knew how to do it, and I was a bit more confident, then actually giving feedback was quite simple. The hardest thing was scanning them and then sending them to the students. I'm sure that comes in a later one, but for this one, we were making one for a course of about 300. So the low-tech version for this is writing a letter to the class. So as you're marking your class's paper, you keep a little table like this beside you, and if when you start noticing strengths and weaknesses that are becoming patterns, then you write them down, and then once you finish marking everything, all of your classes' papers, then you would write a letter saying, these were the things that I saw that were good, these are the things that you guys need to work on. So you're writing a letter to the class, and then they read that letter, and then they look at their essay. So that's two different versions of whole class feedback. And I think one of the biggest positives about this, yes, it's more communicative, but it's this one, it helps critical thinking, because they have to read the feedback and then look at their paper and go, did I do that? Or did I not do that? And where did I do that? So having the student example helps, because that's language that they can access. It's at the right level. It becomes advice rather than correction. So they have to kind of, that links with the critical thinking. They have to look at the advice given, decide whether it is relevant to them. And again, it models transactional English, which is something we're trying to factor in a lot more for this course. The negatives, it's an extra task in marking. So once you've marked your marking load, if you want to do videos like this, it's another step. However, it really, in the end, I think it took it maybe to make the class video maybe about 5 to 10 minutes. So not huge for whole class feedback, and less onerous than individual feedback. I think this was probably the biggest one. It was a new format for the students, and our cohort is primarily Chinese, and they've known the teacher-led model, and they want the teacher-led model. They want one-on-one with the teacher. So we were really interested to see how a whole class video about someone else's paper, whether they'd be satisfied with that. And like I said before, it became an expectation that they would get it. They wanted it, and they liked it because it was at the right level. They found looking at models written by teachers a pitch too high for them, and demotivating because they could never write that anyway. So yeah, that's whole class feedback. So let's move now to recorded verbal feedback. At a few points in the course that the students are doing now, they listen to lectures, and they have to write a paragraph summary of a half an hour to an hour long lecture. And again, the students' expectations is that they would get correction coded feedback. However, we decided to turn it into an exercise in Turnitin. So the students would put their summary. You can see here the student has got a summary of their lecture 1, and we emphasised beforehand that we were not going to be using the correction code on this, although just so you know, Turnitin does have some good correction code. That's because it does actually have correction code little stamps that you can put in, which I'm unable to access at the moment because this class has expired. But we told the students the function of this is we wanted to see how they could structure a paragraph. So they've got their notes, and we wanted to see clear topic sentences, and we wanted to see that they could summarize a half an hour lecture into a paragraph, which is actually pretty difficult because they get bogged down in the details. And then in doing that, instead of giving a correction coded heavy piece back, Turnitin actually has capacity for a comment. So you can do a voice comment here up to 3 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time. It's very difficult to fill 3 minutes with valid comments. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the comment for you, and I hope that you can hear it. It's a little bit hard to hear, but you should be able to get the idea.
Okay, Barry, thanks for submitting this on time. I think that you've made a really good attempt here. I think you've got a little bit confused between the theoretical analysis methods. You seem to focus on the qualitative, the quantitative, and the mixed methods respectively. And I think Russell's main point, Dr. Costa's main point in this lecture is that you need to make sure that what you design is what you do, and that is what you deliver. In terms of your cohesion, you try to link it together on, you use some lectures, some good examples. Just be careful of your linking on the other hand of what's more. Try and use a bit of variety here. And as always, when we're trying to do academic writing, try not to use that first kind But it flows quite well, and I thank you very much for submitting it. Good job.
So hopefully you could hear some of that. Now, as I'm going back and listening to that, I think I was speaking way too fast, and I should have been a bit more aware of the background, so it's my feedback on my feedback. But this is a really good way to focus on something else, so the focus isn't always grammar, and vocab. It can be quite demotivating if if you're producing work and all you're getting back is no, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. They want to know something that they've got right. And when you're giving a voice comment, you tend to be a bit more global because you're not able to interact with the text in the same way that you could with the correction code. So just by its very nature, you tend to say kind of more global, overreaching things than specifics. So, yeah, so here are our 3 different levels for recorded verbal feedback. Turn it in to give a voice comment, or Jing. That's just the name of the company, but Jing is a screencasting software, which I have just up here. And it's very simple to use. Once you've installed it, you just click on what you'd like to capture, and you can record straight away, well, in 3 seconds. So immediately it will start recording what you have been saying. And that's how simple. Recording what you have been saying. So it really is that simple.
And is it free, Margot?
Yes, it's free. For up to 5 minutes. So if you want to do longer than 5 minutes, you will have to pay. But actually 5 minutes is quite good for ESL because it makes you chunk it into smaller bits. And so we trialled this with the students after the success of the whole class feedback. We did this individually for students. Now, you will be limited by your tech and how many computers you have. At the moment, we have 304 students, so it's not really feasible at this stage to do this for each student. But in the smaller courses, and as we train teachers to become more comfortable with this software and the procedure, we'd actually like each teacher to give feedback like this. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the students' feedback. Hopefully.
Okay, Raymond, this is the feedback for the 2 paragraphs that you wrote on these articles. So the good thing here is that your opinion was clear. You established that, so you understood the task, and the main thing was to give your opinion. Now, you could improve this. Instead of saying, I personally hold an opinion, you can just start with the number of bees is at risk. Because if you haven't referenced it, we know it's the writer's opinion. You've tried to use linkers. Your writing is clear. The link is this type, the toxic. You have tried, there's fairly good grammar in there. Now, on the other side, there's a lot of opportunities to use formal language. So there's problems with your expression here. This pesticide will produce poison. The pesticide is poison. It's not producing poison. So you're showing that you didn't understand the article there. So, for example, that's an example of when you've tried to paraphrase, but you've actually changed the meaning. You also said the bees got lost while foraging. They didn't get lost by foraging. They got lost when they came back to the hive. So there's a few issues there. If we look at the second paragraph, again, your position is clear here. I've thought about this. I've changed my opinion a little bit. So this is okay for a first writing, but you can make this more formal and more academic. Again, you've got good attempts at linking. However, actually, again, there's a few issues with subject, plural and single. But generally, a good place to start, Raymond.
That's actually probably one of the first ones I ever did. So you can see I was getting a little bit overwhelmed with pop-ups coming up, and I think I got an email from someone, and halfway through that marking that class, I suddenly lost the ability to be able to highlight. So you know, I felt like I was juggling a lot, but once I got the tech side of it under control, it was quite good. So that was a diagnostic writing that the students did early on. So they hadn't really got to grips with academic English yet. But I mean, it's quite short, it's only 1:47, but I think it's good because the students can listen to it a couple of times. They can kind of pause and read. So normally when we would do writing feedback, and I would sit with each student and give them my feedback. So with 18 students, that would take quite a while. Whereas this way, I had a file on their student drive where all of their videos were. They found their video and they listened to their video for 5 minutes or less than that a couple of times, and then they said a couple of questions, and then it was done. So something that normally would take 2 hours, an hour and a half, only took 5 minutes. So in my book, that's a lot more effective than me, and it's a lot less onerous for the teacher because you're not having to talk for 2 hours straight and get back into the piece and then try and explain, why did I say that? I can't quite remember. So it was quite good to be able to just, be in the paper in that moment and make some really in-depth feedback. Well, not that one, but, for a longer piece. So that's kind of, the mid-tech. So turn it in, and then, high-tech would be the Jing. And for the low-tech, we actually came up with getting the students to just record your feedback on their smartphone while you're talking to them. We trialed this when we didn't have time to make videos. It kind of came up out of necessity. And it was quite good because you could say things in a more complex way and, give them directions. So reread here and look for this, give them some tasks to do. And they had that file recorded on their phone, so they could go back to their desks and listen to that recording a couple of times. So recorded verbal feedback, whether it's a voice comment on an activity and turn it in, whether it's a screencast video with some feedback, or whether it's just the students recording what you're saying, I think it's important because the students can listen many times. And students in the course that they're doing at the moment, it's a preparation course for university, they're always asking, what more can I do, what more can I do, can you do this? They're desperate for feedback, and this is one way where they feel like they've been given concise feedback. It's very personal, and I think this is a great point. The students listen when they are ready. The mere fact that they're pressing play on their computer or their phone means that the student is ready to listen, not just this is their slot in the class to get feedback. The teachers said that they were more present. I definitely found it much easier to give recorded feedback because I could record the feedback straight after I'd marked the paper. I had my thoughts in order. I was very, very focused. Overall, it was more time efficient. That's in terms of giving back to the class time. So that instead of spending 10 minutes per student, we were spending 5 minutes for everyone listened to their personalized video. And just the nature of the videos, you tend to give more global feedback. Negatives, it is new technology, and it was an extra step to record. We trialed this with 3 teachers, and everyone, they all have different levels, but each of them felt a little overwhelmed in the beginning until they got their head around how they were going to do it. So we actually sat together and decided on a strategy of start with the most positive thing, and then only pick 2 or 3 things for the students to focus on, and it tended not to be grammar. It tended to be argument or construction or cohesion or ways to build ways to build an argument rather than the grammar and vocabulary. So that's the end of verbal recorded feedback. Oh, actually it's not. So then, to be very meta, we actually got feedback on the verbal recorded feedback from the students. So in the end of course survey, or mid-course survey, we asked them whether they thought the feedback was very useful, and then this descended into not useful at all. So out of the 16 students that did the survey, 11 found their individual verbal feedback, recorded verbal feedback, very useful. And we also asked them, because we were trialing it with these classes, which one did they like more? Which one did they prefer? The recorded verbal feedback, one-to-one consultations, written feedback, or whole class feedback? And you can see from this feedback that it was definitely the recorded feedback. The individual feedback was was preferred a lot more, and they found it a lot easier than the written feedback. It'll be interesting to see as we go on if that has any effect on their listening skills. One student made a comment, not in this survey, that she found the recordings really useful because she actually wanted to listen to them, whereas the lectures, another thing she said, that they're not on topics that I'm interested in, but I'm really interested in hearing what you think about my work. So there is also a motivation factor in there. I think I'm going very, very fast here, but that's good. It means we'll have more time for questions. The last thing we looked at is recycling feedback. Now, I think we all do recycle feedback and the most basic use of that is using the correction code. I'm pretty sure most schools have some form of a correction code. And essentially that is recycling it because you're not giving the students the answer, you're identifying where it is. And also I think it helps you find themes in the writing when you can see what the student's missing. You can use the same things in Turnitin, the feedback studio, where you're pulling labels across, which is essentially the same thing as the correction code, except that it's on the computer. I think the feedback studio is excellent if you have your own facilities. If you have an iPad or a computer or a tablet, it's great. But if you're having to wait for a computer, if you're having to use a mouse, I found it quite clunky. But if I had a touch screen, a tablet, I found that was a lot easier to use and a lot more accurate. Doing 18 papers that way on a computer with the mouse, we found did not suit my marking style. So training the students with general questions and coded comments. This was there's an article, there it is. The reference will come up with the next slide. But this was a teacher who did the writing the letter to the whole class. He wrote an article for a journal that's referenced at the end here. And he just found that he had comments like this that he was writing all the time. So instead of writing them all the time, he had this in his classroom somewhere, and the students knew that when they saw a 1, it meant this, and it meant this, and it meant this. I quite liked this example. I thought it was very, very useful, and but again, it involves an element of training. The students need to know what the numbers mean. That can be an extra transition for them, a little bit difficult. The only thing that I altered about this method was we've been kind of trained and been talking about not asking students questions because they don't know the answer. So giving imperatives and directives instead of asking a question. I think teachers do it because they think it's quite polite. But actually, sometimes the students get confused, like, just tell me what you want me to do instead of asking me, because I'll do what you ask. So we did alter that a little bit. So here's what we did. This is quite low-tech. When the students did their speaking diagnostic, they recorded their, or made a little video or an audio recording on their phones, and then they sent them to their teachers. That was a really interesting way to do speaking diagnostics because it meant the students could practice a couple of times and then send the one that they recorded that they liked the most, that they thought was the best version. So it kind of gave them a couple of chances, and there was a bit of a transaction in it. They had to pick one. So when they came in, we often just had them on a loop. I'd listen to them because they're only maybe a minute or two long. So I'd listen to them on a loop 2 or 3 times, and the first time I'd get content, the second time I'd get grammar. So it was quite good to be able to listen to it a couple of times as a marker. I found that my feedback was more focused because I had the opportunity to loop it. But again, in marking 18, I found that there were 3 really common themes. So A, B, and C. So using this recycling feedback idea, I dictated, before giving the feedback to the students, I actually dictated them, can you please write A, B, C in your books? And I dictated this, and they wrote it down. And so then I said to them, you'll see down here on that feedback sheet, anytime you see a letter So this student has C, remember to use your face as well as your voice to present. So they got personalized comments based in different areas, but if they saw it an A, a B, or a C, they knew that this thing applied to them. There was one student who was very panicked because he said, "Miss, I don't have any of these." I said, that's okay, that's a good thing. That means, you know, you don't need to improve any of these things. But he was a little concerned that he needed a letter. Yeah, it was kind of cute. But I found it quite useful for me, especially in noticing themes and giving global feedback to the class. It's a lot easier to address those things. And I think you can adapt this in many different ways. Just depends on the task and what you want to focus on. So I think I just got a bit tired by this slide, recycling feedback. It's quite time efficient for the marker. I think it really cut down the marking things, made it very easy to highlight the class themes. I think it was just, the biggest negative was it was hard, not hard, you needed to introduce this idea to the students because it was a shift from normal feedback, which they're used to getting that one-on-one. So that's, I've actually flown through that. I'm sure everyone's going to complain bitterly that it's not an hour, but I've added a few of the resources here that I used. There's the Vimeos, and there's also a few articles that I read. There's my email address if you want to. I'd love to hear if you trial any of these, how that went with your class. I'd love to hear if it was a success, and even if it wasn't, because I'm always interested in, you know, what works with one cohort, what doesn't work with another cohort. I'd really like to try it with a more diverse group of students. I feel like the students that we have at the moment, they're Chinese and they're so focused that I could, you know, ask them to do anything, they do it. So I want to know if it works in another context. So yeah, please get in contact with me if you've got any questions or I haven't explained anything too clearly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Margot. And we've got a bit of time now, so if anybody does have any questions they'd like to ask now, you can type them into the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll relay them to Margot and she can answer them. So I'll just wait a minute or two to see if anyone has any questions. All right, so somebody's just asked how you find using the correction code stamps from Turnitin because they've never used them before.
How to find them?
How you find it, so the process of using them. Sure. Not how to find them, but how you find them. Are they effective?
Oh, right. Sorry, I was like, how to find them? I haven't completely made that transition yet. I found them a bit clunky. I found it was easier. I found that there was everything there that I needed, and it was good because it had examples. It kind of defines what the problem is, and that made it easier than me having to explain the correction code to each student. However, I found it a bit clunky to link it to the right spot, and it wasn't as flexible as obviously my handwriting. So I preferred, I've much preferred the handwriting, but that was me being selfish because that just suited me better. The students much preferred getting the stamps because it was in one place and they didn't have to print something out. They said, you know, they're transitioning to electronic portfolios. So they were kind of a little bit annoyed. They're like, well, now you've given us a piece of paper and there's nothing to resolve. Whereas if you put the buttons on in Turnitin, they can resolve it and it becomes a live kind of working document.
Okay, great. Someone's asked, with the recycled feedback that has the coded comments, does it also take time for the teacher to learn the codes?
Well, it's teacher directed, so you can make it up to be whatever you want. So in the article that I got the idea from, the teacher, he had a really strict set of codes, but I think you can just morph with your class. So the class that I've been teaching most recently has a lot of problems with pronunciation, especially fricative, so we talked about that. So I think each class that I've used it with, I don't have a this is my correction code. It morphs and changes with the task, more than the grammar and the vocab correction code, because that's quite set. Those things don't really change. But the more global feedback, I think, depends on the task, depends on the class, depends on what your focus is for that day.
Okay. All right. I think that's the end of the questions. There's lots of thank yous coming through for Margot. All right, yeah, so I don't think there are any more questions. So I'd also like to thank you, Margot, from on behalf of English Australia for today's webinar. It's always great to hear people's stories from the classroom and very practical examples, and, especially ones that address the issue of time poor teachers, and people who understand that really is a reality. So thank you so much for sharing these ideas with us.
No problem.
Yeah. All right, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, and hopefully you'll be able to put some of these ideas into use in your classroom. All right, bye.